Hi, everyone. We're joined by Daniel Pinchbeck, which is an honor today. He's an author on the subject of psychedelics and spirituality, featured in Wired magazine and the New York Times. He's written such books as Breaking Open the Head, A Psychedelic Journey into the Heart of Contemporary Shamanism, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, Notes from the Edge Times, How Soon Is Now, and most recently, When Plants Dream, and The Occult Control System. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited for this conversation. Lev has opened me to this world of, I don't like using the word esoteric because it seems like a cop-out, but it is. A lot of these known unknowns, unknown unknowns, it seems like with, especially in the media right now, all this talk about UFOs, like we are approaching a new renaissance or revelation of understanding of things we may have even known for a long time.
And reading your book, it really felt like I was a kid at a candy store. I'm talking about the occult control system. And it is very short, but it's super satisfying.
You have such a long history of experience with these subjects. And so I imagine you've gone through stages of acceptance or dismissal and open-minded and closed-minded people. And what's been your experience with that, like opening people's minds or challenging their expectations?
Yeah, well, as you said, that's a bit of a long story. I mean, Breaking Open the Head came out in 2002. So I started writing it around 1999 or 2000, 99, I guess. You know, I got really fascinated in the subject of psychedelics in the late 90s. And I was working as a journalist. And in New York, you really could not talk about the subject of psychedelics openly with people in the media world and the literary world. People just laugh at you. And yet these experiences I had were so profound that I was like, sort of, wait a second, like what's happening here? And, you know, I think that book, you know, which got a good cultural reception and you know, continues to be read and continues to be quite popular, helped kind of open the doorway for the mainstream to kind of dip back into the whole subject of psychedelics, and was kind of like, you know, one of the books that helped to start the new psychedelic renaissance, which has become a major thing in our world right now. Yeah, I feel that I've really, actually, when I look back at my writing history, I pat myself on the back because I feel that I've actually been writing again and again. The second book was about, it was called 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, and it was about the prophecies of cultures like the Maya and the Hopi. I actually still think it's my best book. Certainly, it's a really profound, long read. And, you know, once again, that was a subject that wasn't taken seriously. You know, in a way, I trapped myself a bit with the title because the book was called 2012. People were like, oh, nothing happened in 2012. The world didn't end. In fact, that's never what the book said. The book just said that we were moving through these kind of different stages. And, you know, these indigenous cultures seem to have an understanding, a prophetic understanding of the transformations that we were undergoing as a society. And the sort of, you know, among the things that I pointed towards that seemed to indicate that they knew something or had a premonition or whatever was, you know, what's happening with technology, its incredible rapid evolution, the reconnection of science and mysticism, and the ecological crisis, which of course indigenous cultures have been, you know, very concerned about, and really all around the world, the indigenous people are kind of on the front lines of resisting the oil companies and the extractive industries and so on. So I feel that book was very, very prescient in that I saw that, you know, this whole ecological crisis was going to come to dominate human consciousness over the next, you know, period. And I do believe that, you know, 2012 was a threshold time, and that, you know, if we look at what's happened with Trump and so many things that are happening, it's clear we've entered a different type of reality that wasn't really even imaginable to people, you know, back in 2010. Which, you know, it's subtle and hard to describe, but it's like something about the very nature of reality has shifted, whether it's through social media, whether it's through kind of the psychedelic awakening, through transformational festivals and occultism, kind of coming back. Then I wrote another book, How Soon Is Now, which was looking at the ecological crisis as a kind of collective rite of passage for humanity. That came out in 2017. And in that book, not only did I see the ecological event that we're entering as a kind of initiation that would totally transform humanity's relationship to the planet and itself, I also offered a model for a systemic transformation that would allow us to avert our own extinction. And now we see a few years later that we really are on the path to extinction rapidly. And I still feel that book, which although I got Russell Brand and Sting to write introductions for the book, because they were friends of mine and supporters of my work primarily, could not get any traction for it in the mainstream media, and therefore couldn't really get the kind of sales for it that I'd hoped. I still feel that book is extremely important and actually quite an easy read. It took me like 10 years to put it together to help us kind of reposition our thinking for what's coming now. And and so then most recently, When Plants Dream just came out. I wrote it with a young woman anthropologist, Sophia Rocklin, and we look at the whole ayahuasca boom, the global renaissance of psychedelics, how ayahuasca is transforming individuals and cultures, and the effect it's having. And then the occult control system, which as Lev mentioned is kind of like a long essay that jumped off from some of the material that I wrote in the 2012 book, which was really an effort to kind of really look into the UFO phenomenon, the alien abduction phenomenon, and think about it from different perspectives, including a kind of occult or spiritual science perspective.
What's your process for research? Do you find yourself reading forbidden texts, or are there, because a lot of those areas, I think you briefly talk about in your book, are kind of like, they're discouraged areas, right? Like you kind of disqualify yourself from the mainstream a little bit, or people don't as readily take you seriously when you open your mind to certain things. And did you find yourself, when you were going on your own journey, following your nose and researching, do you find yourself reading forbidden texts, or is there no such thing? Is that a misnomer? Do you feel that we're way past that concept of forbidden texts? Like I can think of some that might.
I don't know what you mean by forbidden texts.
A forbidden text is, I would say maybe like I'll pull one out of the air. So they recently did a television special on the Unabomber, right? Which is what made me interested to read the Unabomber's manifesto. Now, when I tell my parents like, oh, I'm reading the Unabomber manifesto, they're like, why on earth would you want to read that? Like, why would you ever want to read that? And so that's an exaggerated example of a forbidden text, where it's clearly not forbidden. We're not in the USSR. Like people aren't throwing us in jail or psych wards for like reading things we're not allowed to read. But other books, like there's a book Lev told me about called Prometheus and Atlas, which is about suppression of knowledge. He basically makes an academic argument citing very mainstream philosophers that there's knowledge of, he calls it parapsychological phenomena. So I guess it's a form of psychic phenomena. Like there's a tethering that humans and animals can have that is, whether it's in a quantum realm or something. And he also talks about extraterrestrials in his book. Now, when you read his book, Prometheus and Atlas, to me, it seems very far-fetched. Like I'm kind of a Michael Shermer skeptic. It had some negative press basically saying like, this guy is like, he's a white supremacist, he's a racist, don't read his book about suppression of knowledge. And that to me was like, oh, I would put that in the category of a forbidden text. And so I know as an alien researcher or psychic researcher, I'm also curious if you're familiar with Giorgiani's book, Prometheus and Atlas.
Never heard of it.
There's parallels in the short essay that I read of yours and what he says. And this is all stuff that I used to just totally dismiss to a quarantine of information not worth looking at carefully.
Yeah. Well, I'm starting a new magazine right now called Liminal. Liminal.news is the website. And essentially, liminal states are kind of like edge realms, initiatory zones where things are turned upside down. And I think we're in a cultural liminal zone. And then often when, all of the certainties that people have had are kind of overturned, then in a way you have to look towards the edges, because often that's where the new ideas are beginning to take shape. The new myths, the new beliefs, the new structures of understanding.
So I find myself attracted to forbidden texts. Like I would almost put you in a category of forbidden texts. Like from where I come from, as far as my background goes, like I think a lot of skeptics or people who are materialists, as you would describe, like they don't want to become pariahs in polite society, right? They want to like always have right think. And so anything that's like out of the normal, whether it's Rupert Sheldrake or people that believe in aliens or psychics or Alex Jones, or like there's a lot of stuff that I think people are trying to break down communication between people to like suss things out. And I'm almost attracted to things that others call like would kind of emote forbiddenness, whether that's even real or tangible.
No, totally. Well, and then you also have the phenomenon when a lot of people break out of the materialist, kind of construct, they can become almost too susceptible, like they don't know how to discern. And that's actually been a lot of, the focus of my work, like, I'd say particularly the 2012 book, but also Breaking Open the Head. I think in the Breaking Open the Head, there was a line from a song, my mind's not so open that anything can crawl right in, And so that's a problem that we see. Like then you have people going to flat Earth or, being susceptible to believe that, there's these vast underground bases in Mars that we, are already like, in cahoots with so-and-so. I mean, you have to be, I think you have to be open and retain kind of skepticism, but also recognize that, there are limits to rationality and, that we don't really know everything that's going on. And, that's kind of what I was trying to do in the new book also, was kind of like look beyond the veil of what, we can normally speak about and figure out how do we begin to speak about those things. Because what if they are legitimate? Like what if there is, interdimensional pests who are, kind of infesting human consciousness and taking us, in some type of like trance-like, in between the physical and the imaginal, state into these crafts and performing these experiments. And, like what if there is this whole thing going on, which so many people report, over and over again, in, from totally different angles. And how do we deal with that? Like we have to be able to begin to talk about it in the normal world. It has to become available, accessible to us. And if something is totally inaccessible and, forbidden, then maybe it has more power, over us than if we can begin to find a way to name it. And kind of names are kind of like containers in a way.
Mm. Well, the basic gist of your book is that humanity is undergoing this polarity shift where physically manifested material existence is going to meet up with the dream world, and they will merge together for a period, according to Sergio Magama, who is this Aztec sorcerer coming from a long lineage of Aztec sorcerers. It's going to happen every 5,000 years. And right now our transition is from 2012 till 2021.
Sure. So Lev, I would also say that's slightly like, an over literalization in a way of what I present. So I offer a range, and I talk about how, when you get into these different occult or esoteric viewpoints, you do have to be very careful. And it's not like suddenly popping into another belief system. It's almost like, moving between them. I really liked William Owen Thompson, who's one of the most sophisticated writers in this area, talked about, you could look at these different efforts to kind of elucidate these occult cosmologies, whether it's Rudolf Steiner or Blavatsky or Gurdjieff, or in his own way, Sergio Magana. They're almost like kind of types of music. They overlap in different ways, but you have to be careful not to collapse into literalization too quickly, because then you kind of miss the boat somehow.
Well, there are certain things people can agree upon as far as certain systems of technology, for lack of a better word, when it comes to, let's say, the Jews, they have in their esoteric circles the Kabbalistic tree of life, and the Hindus, they have the seven chakras and Kundalini. Do you see there being some kind of a perennialism in a lot of these different systems that do talk about something that many different people, regardless of what culture they're from, can agree upon, where, let's say, in Judaism, certain aspects that are in Hinduism have been a lot more hidden, and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in the 2012 book, I mean, I definitely tried to draw those lines of connection and see that there were, yeah, kind of like correspondences between these different mystical traditions, and also between the work of modern kind of thinkers who accept the reality of the psyche or have an esoteric viewpoint, like Rudolf Steiner and Carl Jung. Like, I think you can map those two onto each other, and it's really productive to do so. So yeah, I mean, I mean, Huxley obviously wrote a book on the perennial philosophy. I mean, basically, there's an idea that there's kind of one consciousness, that we're all expressions of, that consciousness is like infinitely divisible. Steiner talked about it as the I. The I is our link to the divine source. And in the Hindu and the Vedas, they talk about how each of us is like a drop in this ocean. The drop is separate from the ocean, but it's also one with the ocean. A lot of these traditions also talk about these intermediate levels of spirits. So there's a lot of correspondences, but you do, I think, have to be, just a little circumspect. It requires like a different act of the will and the intellect to kind of deal with these areas without it coming out kind of like stupid in a way, like too crude. And the problem is that our language itself is not equipped for this, because our language is a dualistic language, which is based on, it's very materialist in its essence in a way. Like, we see things as these simple dualisms between like spirit and matter, or truth and false, or, whatever. And actually, for instance, languages like the indigenous languages often, look at reality quite differently.
I really liked how in your book you were talking about a lot of these indigenous cultures seeing the physical human body as the spiritual body, where they don't differentiate between the two.
Yeah, well, I mean, they probably differentiate in some ways, but it's not as different as we see it. They see that the physical body is also a subtle body, and it can actually enter into these other dimensional realities, or however you want to language them.
Well, the difference for me is if we're talking about being in a psychedelic state, let's say you're in ayahuasca or you're taking DMT, for instance, and you're meeting these various entities, as they're called, like clockwork elves, all that stuff, the way that you would, let's say, as an anatomist, describe how they're formed, from what I understand, they would be very fractal, much like we're fractal, but they're also much more perfect in that if you zoom in on them, you'd probably see additional animations going on inside them, as opposed to seeing like little microbes that are occupying these imperfect areas in our skin. Do you see there being a differentiation then between those types of visions and our very human physicality?
Can you contextualize Clockwork Elves for anybody that's watching this episode as a standalone without other knowledge?
Just like fairies or elves or imps or anything of that sort, these, from what I understand, are supposed to be fantastical beings that people have experienced in altered states. I could say they're a bit tricksterish sometimes, playful. I know, Daniel, am I getting it right, you'd say?
Well, my understanding as the staple skeptic is Alex Jones. I heard talk about this, and people encounter these through DMT trips, it seems. Maybe also through other psychedelic experiences and other spiritual experiences not involving substance intake. But to me, the most standout version of the Clockwork Elves people experience through DMT trips, and their descriptions sound like time crystals almost, which is like something we've invented, or something that we've, or it's something that I guess we see through an astral plane. And this is where the language fails us, right? Because we don't really have the language architecture for describing things. It's like describing a color you haven't seen yet, or, so. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like, yeah, and even this whole, I mean, I think the original term that Lev is referencing is the machine elves of hyperspace, which was Terence McKenna's term. And, I've actually never seen machine elves in the same way that he describes them on dimethyltryptamine. I've had a sense of encountering other, types of hyperdimensional reality or other levels or forms of consciousness that seemed really, really powerful and far beyond, what we know. I mean, I have encountered kind of elves on other substances that I wrote about in Breaking Open the Head, like very much like a traditional, green capped elves and so on. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in this, and really learning even how to think about it properly is something that we really don't have any discernment or skill for at this point. I mean, for me right now, I'm going back to the work of Rudolf Steiner, who I think is the healthiest philosophical, grounded kind of approach to esotericism and occultism that I found. And I recommend for people who want to go down that exploration, his book, How to Know Higher Worlds, is kind of the introduction, and then the Outline of Esoteric Science is really, lays out the results of his many years of experience. And I guess he was born in like the 1860s, lived to 1925. He was somebody who was just gifted with the capacity to enter into these visionary states, almost like he could, produce a surplus of DMT or kind of go into an ayahuasca visionary state at will. And he realized that people around him didn't have this capacity. So he was careful not to talk about it. And he got a doctorate of philosophy. He was studying Goethe's science papers. Goethe had a whole theory of knowledge and a theory of science that then informed Steiner's approach. And he actually waited till he was like 40 years old till he started to publicly discuss his own esoteric investigations. Then the last 25 years of his life, he created a whole huge volume of material, many, many books and lectures. And also he was responsible for the Waldorf school system, which is the largest, I think it's still the largest independent education movement in the West. Biodynamic farming came out of his philosophy, and homeopathy. So I find that very fascinating, is that he was both an incredible visionary who talked about all these other worlds and worlds within worlds and cosmic evolution and reincarnation and so on. Then he was able to also take those ideas and implement them in systems that remain usable today and are seem to be quite healthy and have a positive effect on many people's lives.
I really love Rudolf Steiner's work, and it's really interesting for me when he talks about disembodied spirits yearning to have sensory experiences and learning to handle those cravings of the ego by transmuting them. And that also reminds me a lot of the Kabbalah, as outlined by Yehuda Ashlag, who is considered to be a bit of a rebel in rabbinical circles. But he talks about how humanity has to learn to convert their egoism into altruism, and like beyond any thought forms or archons or anything of that nature. They say that the state of the creator is one of full giving without wanting anything in return. And there is no way for me to prove anything like that, but that feels much more realistic to me than the idea of this top demiurge that controls everything, whose will we're ultimately under.
Well, it's not an either or thing. I mean, there may be many, many layers to the onion. I mean, I love what you just described. And, please, when we're done with this call, I really am curious about the references you guys made. So send me little links. But yeah, I love that idea of the creator as pouring out his gift through altruism. And yet there may be another level where there is a kind of scheming, dark demiurge who is almost like, constraining human potential and living, absorbing the energy of our devotion and of our fear body. And I think that, to me, that's like John Lamb Lash wrote a book called Not in His Image that I talk about, the occult control system, which I think is a very powerful book. And, you look at Christianity that way, this whole idea of like transcendence, like spirit over matter, and the crucified Christ, and, this idea that, you have faith in Christ's divinity, whereas, if you look at the Gnostic Gospels, it's quite obvious that Christ was, offering kind of a model for, human existence, a kind of path that we can follow. And and a very altruistic one, a very service-oriented one. So, Christianity, may be what the Gnostics would have, considered like an archonic deviation that trapped people in this kind of a belief faith structure, rather than them, using their precious time in human embodiment to, seek their own knowledge through, esoteric practices, visionary plants, and so on.
It seems to be a mix of both for me, honestly, because when I take a look at, let's say, a nice Christian family going to church every Sunday, there's nothing wrong with that. They're just living as good of a life as they can. But I also see in Judaism and in Christianity these spectral influences as well. For example, in Acts 9, 22, and 26 in the Old Testament, Paul and his companions experience bright lights in the sky. And if we go back to the book of Exodus, the journey that the Hebrews made from Egypt had them following a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. And if you also think about the smoke emanating from the top of Mount Sinai, to me, a lot of these things, if they actually happened, sound a lot like paranormal occurrences, where, as strange as it is, I think that what we are experiencing in this self-referential thought form that we exist in are all of these very trickster-like entities that move us in this Rube Goldberg type machine to a certain conclusion. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have free will, but I'm leaning on the idea that certain things are created for us to experience a certain outcome.
Wait, so in other words, what you said is you quoted the Bible and you think those are references to extraterrestrials.
Yes.
Okay, because that was a mouthful way of, but yes, I follow, because I didn't grow up with a lot of knowledge of Bible stuff, and when I hear paranormal, I get confused, and because I think everything is natural, right? I think if it exists, it's natural, right? Because I think natural are things that are caused by and exist in nature. So that can be a frustration to people who try to use the word unnatural to me, because in my book, to be a pedant, I'm like, well, everything is technically natural. So paranormal, though, is not really like, what's paranormal and supernatural? Are they different? Are they the same?
Well, relative to what we find to be normal.
Matter.
It's like relative to what we find to be normal, I think.
It's like
what we're used
rare
to.
anomalous occurrences that we can't.
Well, I mean, nature and artificial. I mean, we need to be able to make distinctions. So when you say that everything is nature, you're kind of obliterating our capacity to make distinctions that maybe are useful in relative conversations. I think there's Murray Bookchin, who wrote a book on the ecology of freedom, which I wrote about in How Soon Is Now. He uses the distinction, I think, of first nature and second nature. So you'd say first nature would be like plants, animals, microbes. Second nature is human transformations of nature into cultural artifacts, into mechanical devices, and so on. I mean, we obviously are going to need to make some distinction, otherwise we can't talk about anything.
That's how Rudolf Steiner also made his distinctions, as far as there being the plant kingdom, the mineral kingdom, the human kingdom, and he had all of these various hierarchies of angels, archai, spirits of personality, thrones, whatnot. But what I find very interesting is what you were writing about concerning the Luciferian spirit, the light-bringer spirit. For those who don't know, Lucifer is supposed to be this light-bringer entity who, as you describe, is manifested within beings that, let's say we've already advanced so high up, we don't need a physical body anymore. We could just go and play around, do whatever we want, kind of like be the artists that we are in this body, restricted to picking up, a pencil or a pen or the Cintiq that I have in front of me to create the things in our imagination. But maybe at a certain point, it goes beyond that, where we can become artists just utilizing everything that's around us. And I find that to be very fascinating. But at the same time, I wonder what the ways are of going from here. So you have, on one hand, merging with oneness, merging with God or whatever. Then you have becoming this Luciferian entity where you can participate in all of this beautiful artwork. And then you also have the negative side, which is this Ahrimanic aspect, as you called it. And Ahriman, for those who don't know, is considered to be the original Satan. In Zoroastrianism, I believe that's the first religion to distinguish between good and evil, where good was represented by Ahura Mazda and evil was represented by Ahriman. So you talk about this Ahrimanic aspect in relation to technology. Am I correct about that?
Lev, I guess my concern hearing you speak, like I really appreciate all the pieces that you're bringing together, but I'm afraid that it's like so much for most people that they're just going to be left scratching their head and have no access to what we're talking about here. So I think you have to really go slow, and which is something that Steiner himself is actually very, very good at if you read his work in sequence, because it's like when you sort of rush pell-mell for all of this stuff, it's just like, for most people, it's just like a miasma where they can't possibly hold on to anything. And so I mean, like, and the question is, how much of our time do you want to use to talk about this? Because it's 15 minutes just to unpack what you just said, but I can do it. So Rudolf Steiner, as we mentioned, incredible visionary who had this visionary sight, and kind of like the visions one might experience on ayahuasca or LSD or DMT, but he really had access to that all the time. And he talked about it as the ability to read the Akashic records. And he said that, in these visionary states, he could go back and he could read the cosmic history of humanity from these previous incarnations to the future, that there were all these different types of super sensible beings that were connected to humanity's development. He actually said that he incarnated on the earth with a specific mission at that point in time. Do you know what that mission was?
To teach people about reincarnation?
Exactly. Yeah, very good. Yeah, so he said that the mission of his life on earth was to bring the knowledge of reincarnation back to the West, that had been lost with Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, monotheism. And that he said that just that people incarnate again and again, very much as we have in the Tibetan tradition, where you have these lamas who they're recognized as being the reincarnation of past lamas, the whole series of lives, like the Dalai Lama himself. And he said that not only do people incarnate again and again, much like in the Tibetan tradition, but also the earth itself incarnates and goes through different stages that are intimately related to the evolution of consciousness in humans, but then also in the, as you said, the plant world, the mineral world, everything undergoes these evolutionary cycles. And as you said, he, in a way, Steiner was an esoteric Christian, and that he believed that, there was, kind of an esoteric meaning in Christ's appearance on the earth. And he also believed that among the forces that were working on us through the supersensible realm, some of them were positive, some of them were neutral, some of them were quite negative. And the negative ones were seeking to deviate our development onto harmful paths. And among these beings that he felt were potentially seeking to deviate us onto harmful paths, he sort of, in the Bible, they just have the idea of the devil or Satan or whatever, but he differentiated this into these different types of beings, which, as you mentioned, he talked about as two forces, being the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic. And Lucifer is a more ambivalent one, because, as you said, Lucifer means light bringer. That's the translation. And in fact, Steiner had a magazine that he edited called Lucifer Gnosis, light bringer knowledge. So he saw that Lucifer was a force that humanity needed, that was bringing us up to higher levels of knowledge and creativeness, creativity and accomplishment. And as you said, it connected us to a class of super sensible beings that didn't incarnate in physical bodies anymore. They'd gone beyond that, in their evolution. Yet they were still needing to continue their evolution, and the way they would do that would be by making an alliance with a human being. And this is what, like in the Greek tradition, they talked about the daimon, or in the Islamic tradition, they talked about the genie. The genie is the same word that we talk about with genius, has the same kind of origin. So this idea that, that they talked about in the classical world, that if somebody had a genius, it wasn't really them, it was more like they were in alliance with a spiritual entity or doing something, along those lines. And then, as you said, the aromatic force is more a force that pulls us down. We think of that the luciferic is pulling us up and away from the earth towards like beauty and haughtiness and genius, but also kind of arrogance, cutting us off from the earthly. And then the aromatic is more this force that's pulling us down towards materiality, minerality, kind of sterility, material technologies. So, and Steiner actually believed that he was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, he said that in the 21st century, Ahriman was going to make his great ascendance, was going to sort of incarnate into the human realm in the same way Christ had incarnated 2,000 years ago. As my memory of it is that this would also be a necessary part of our evolution, but a difficult, kind of a dark passage. And what I argue in the occult control system is that, it may be that we're seeing with artificial intelligence and the desire on the part of the technocracy to birth a generalized AI, and also to kind of substantiate potentially the human ego in imperishable bodies, technological bodies or genetically replicating bodies. It would be kind of like the fulfillment of this, Steiner's prophecy of the aromatic incarnation. And I also propose that potentially the alien abduction saga and the kind of possibility that is going to unfold in some way in the future. At the moment, it's a liminal phenomenon. It's on kind of the edge of cultural perception. But then there are these, many, many books and documents which reiterate these same themes that many people report being brought aboard these ships. And it's it's very interesting because there's no cultural depth to these aliens. If they were from another civilization that developed on another world, you would think they would have their own culture, their own, kind of anything. But really, they seem to exist entirely in this kind of parasitic relationship to us. And they're seeking to mine our genetics. Often they're trying to give birth to these hybrid human aliens. But often they warn abductees, or they tell them that there's going to be an ecological catastrophe. That point, the future will be these hybrid human aliens will be prepared to take over the earth, and there won't be any place for humans as they're currently constituted. So I see that as part of this kind of archetypal or mythological unfolding that supports this kind of Steiner idea of this aromatic incarnation.
Lev and I hosted a pre and post debate show for the transhumanist party, and there was a candidate who was not able to attend, but on the ticket said that he was a human alien hybrid, and we really wanted to talk to this guy. We were looking forward to it. I was skeptical, but as I don't want to say that anymore because now I want to make a speculation. Lev just tried to connect stories in religious texts to they might be describing aliens or extraterrestrials. In your book, you described how there's stories of folklore like fairies and things like that might also be referring to extraterrestrials. So the folklore might be referring to aliens. Stories in the religious texts might be referring to aliens.
Aliens is a catch-all, nomenclature for we don't really know what yet. But and one of my favorite books on the subject is Patrick Harper's work is really, really fascinating. I talked about him in my book. But yeah, that connection between the fairy culture and the stories of the Middle Ages, and the sort of resonances that has with these abduction accounts is truly fascinating.
So I'm wondering for people who, let's speculate these things exist. Like, are there benevolent and malevolent ones? And is there a difference between clockwork elves, for example? So beings you might encounter through a astral plane or a psychedelic trip, and the ones that poke in and out of our skies with those unexplainable feats of moving 25,000 miles per hour,
Well, I mean, according to
popping in and out of existence.
Eastern Vedanta, I mean, the universe is the dream of consciousness, and so yeah, on one level, it's all one. It's all different expressions of this dream that consciousness is having, as it explores its creative capacities in worlds and universes that it creates.
Did you see Christopher Nolan's Interstellar?
Nope.
Well, it's a really great movie, and I don't want to spoil it. I think you would really like it. So, and I'm not going to tie it in here, but I think that I would say to anyone that loves your book, I would strongly recommend Interstellar too, because it's about that kind of transition and awareness, and then it goes in a lot of unexpected directions.
I mean, generally, science fiction is the way that our collective psychology gets to play with these ideas and present these different parameters of possibility. One of my favorite recent ones was Arrival. Did you see that?
Oh no, I have to see that.
Yeah, that one really felt very in sync with a lot of the ideas that I explored in the 2012 book.
There's a poetry, right? They have to communicate to the aliens through poetry. Is that someone spoiled that for me?
No, not exactly through poetry, but they have to understand the way that the extraterrestrials are communicating and how their language, these sort of sign languages they create in themselves embody a different relationship to time, space, and the psyche. And it's almost like by learning how to speak that language, it's like they can unlock the key to a survivable future.
In relating to your book 2012, I had a question about the crop circle message. Towards the end of the book, you talked in brief about the message from what you perceive to be benevolent entities. One in particular being, quote, "Beware the bearers of false gifts and broken promises." And you write about the author Richard Dolan associating this with the idea of this military intelligence enacting societal control among like the highest circles of power, not being affected by that, but becoming a breakaway civilization, while everybody else remains this slavish underclass. And like, as far as the signs to look for in terms of the bearers of false gifts, I just wanted to give my own personal perspective, or rather the perspective of my family. And before that, I just wanted to mention that as hard as you are on Trump, and when it comes to the disgraceful policies such as the loosening of restrictions on pollution, I am 100% with you, as well as the forbidding of the use of stem cells, which George W. Bush did as well. But anyway, regardless of that, I also appreciate you being just as hard on Barack Obama for all the drone bombing that he did, despite winning the Nobel Peace Prize. But anyway, in terms of those bears...
It's not really about being hard on Obama or Trump, but they're all kind of like, to me, the neoliberal regime, was also not really doing anything to really, safeguard the biosphere's integrity. And in fact, they were bragging about fracking and about, the positive effect they had on Wall Street. So the differential between them and, previous neoconservative, rulers was really not very much. I mean, Trump, is definitely an incredible phenomenon in that he's destroyed, all of the norms of society. He's definitely playing the archetype of the trickster who disrupts and overturns all the norms and all the conventions. And it's a very scary scenario because, we really could be moving towards, breakdown of civility, civil war, with violent breakaway factions. And this is all happening, in a time when the ecological crisis and also eventually the crisis of just resource depletion, could become very, very palpable for many people. So, maybe this is what it takes for the system to finally break down because this whole hierarchical structure of authoritarian power is not something that's going to survive, it's not going to keep us alive for much longer. One of the books that's really crucial to me and that I heartily recommend is this book by Gene Gebser. That was a kind of something that I discussed at length in the 2012 book, the The Ever-Present Origin, which looks at the evolution of consciousness in these different structures. And he argues that we're on the cusp of a mutational break from a structure that he calls the mental rational structure to one that he talks about as the integral structure. His work was also very influential on Ken Wilber, the Buddhist philosopher. But I really recommend that book if you want to have a deeper kind of understanding of what's happening and what's at stake in terms of this kind of breakdown of authority, kind of inability to just tell real from fake, breakdown of truth, these strange phenomena on the edge of consciousness, which seem to be more and more kind of like coming towards the center. Very, very useful guidebook.
I will check that out. But what I wanted to mention regarding the quote-unquote bearers of false gifts is that in my own family's history living in the USSR, I'd say the government there, the Politburo, was the utmost representation of the bearers of false gifts, where they wanted to create this artificial reality that people were living in, that, oh, we have all this prosperity, nobody's dying, we have all of this wonderful stuff around us. Meanwhile, it was the complete opposite. So what I don't want to have happen is, as Jules and I call it, government supremacy, where if we take away the horrible, I think, neoconservative, and I think partly Trotskyite aspect that was in Republican circles, just take that metastasizing tumor away. What I personally think we have left with are more or less people who just want to be left alone. At worst, they would have qualities of, I got mine. But other than that, we're talking about people who want limited government and who want private property. And we're not talking about people that would welcome in a world government Elysium type system, which, judging from what the USSR was able to do, I think we should be very, very careful in not having repeat.
I think government does a lot to break down cooperation between people. And I think that we need superior charity. And charity, I think a lot of people think about it in terms of just like, you go to church and you put money in the basket. And I don't really think that's even what real charity is. Like, real charity is a lot more about giving your time even than it is to just giving resources. And I think communities used to take a lot of responsibility for collective mental health. And I've heard stories of how the FBI would go to church leaders and tell them to stop being active in their communities, right? They would pay churches to like be less active. And I recently saw a bunch of people clean up an area that was just overrun with trash and garbage. People went in and just cleaned it up. I think if government is the only person that is government's not a person. If government's the only thing that is responsible for taking care of people, I think it's a long-term bad idea that will break down more and more. And I think that we need a culture that accomplishes what the most romantic people want government to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is getting us off into a whole other subject matter, which is something I did, kind of try to address in How Soon Is Now, my third book. Yeah, I mean, gosh, I was just reading the other day such a horrible story about Chinese organ harvesting.
Yeah, the Falun Gong.
Yeah, that they apparently are doing this on like an industrial scale, and wealthy people from other countries can then go and buy these black market organs from the Chinese. And that was like really, like, when I read that, I just felt so like I wanted to puke, honestly. And then I was just thinking about how, maybe when you have these vast governmental structures, it's just they ultimately move towards, because it's basically, it allows you to kind of like outsource evil. Like, evil becomes something very abstract and down the chain. Kind of the same thing we're seeing with the, what's happening with the, children of these migrants who are basically being abused and brain damaged, by the U.S. government. But I think with the ecological mega crisis that's coming, unfortunately, we're going to see a lot of breakdown, of current existing structures, and we're either going to move towards authoritarianism. I think in the short term, we may very well move into that direction, but that also is not going to hold up. So I think ultimately it's going to be something different if humanity survives, which I'm actually not convinced it's going to, or in large numbers. It'd be something more like localization, bioregionalism, recreating community groups. I mean, we know like the Dunbar number that really we're only able to keep about 150 people, 150 relationships, in our lives anyway. Yeah, like nested holons, I guess was Arthur Kessler's idea, like, communities that are nested together, but within a planetary, local to bioregional to planetary, where people were really, as you said, kind of out of their egoic minds and recognizing that, we have to work together like, bees in a hive in a way. And I personally, I'm not I think that the epoch of private property will also come to an end at some point. Tribal societies, indigenous societies don't really have it in the same way. They have something more basic, which is like an usufruct model, where if you're using something productively, you keep using it. If you're in a society that's really based on trust, then the laws that we've created are kind of unnecessary. But this is something that would take us hours and hours to unpack, and maybe we can do it on another call, as I do think our time is running short for today.
I would definitely love to have another call with you, Daniel, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about all of this stuff with us.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And it was great to meet you, Jules, and to see you again. And let's all get a beer in New York sometime.
That'd be great. And next time we can talk about Hollow Earth, which is my favorite conspiracy theory.
Gartha.
Is that
my girlfriend's obsessed with it, so I'll get her on that call.
Is she?
She thinks she found the tunnels to it in a Italian kind of mountain village.
Oh,
Yes.
wow. Excellent.
Yes.
They're all over the place, those tunnels.
Yeah.
All right, Daniel, thank you so much.
Have a great night.